history of political movements, few have accumulated as much power as the Chinese Communist Party. Its influence extends both inward to the everyday lives of Chinese citizens and outward as it expands its sphere of economic and military power around the world. But the party's origins are more modest than its current form would indicate. It's a story that begins with the end of World War I, the gathering of a small group of Chinese intellectuals, and a Dutchman. That story is the focus of a new book by Harvard Kennedy School professor Tony Sage. Professor Sage has studied the rise of China on a global scale since the 1970s, when a professor told him, no matter what happens in this place, it's going to affect all our lives. To help us understand why, Professor Sage's latest book brings us back a century to the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. On this episode of Behind the Book, we speak with Tony Sage, director of the Ash Center for Democracy and Government Innovation and Daewoo Professor of International Affairs, about his book, Finding Allies and Making Revolution, The Early Years of the Chinese Communist Party. Let's do a little scene setting. In 1911, the Xinhai Revolution ended 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. In its place, the Republic of China was established. However, the Republic was relatively weak, as much of the country was under the control of warlords from 1915 to 19... China's revolutionaries.
And you begin to see them moving to the more extreme solutions and the more extreme ideologies that they think is going to provide an overall solution for China. And then, of course, they look at Soviet Russia and say, hey, that's successful. It's broken the chain of, an imperial system. It's broken the chain of dominance by the colonial powers. And then eventually, the economy begins to move forward as well. So it looked an attractive alternative.
The interest was mutual. Lenin hoped that the establishment of the Soviet Union would spark a global working-class movement worldwide, including in China. Spreading communism to China became one of Lenin's priorities.
They identified China as a revolutionary base for the whole of East Asia. So originally, the idea was it wouldn't just be China, but it would pull in Korea, it would pull in Japan.
What happens next is the subject of Professor Sage's book, which takes advantage of the recent publication of two key sets of archival documents. The first from Moscow, at the archives of the Comintern, and the second from Amsterdam, at the Institute for Social History. Together, these materials provided Professor Sage with a more nuanced narrative of the CCP, particularly around its relationship with Soviet powers. As communism gained more influence in China, the Comintern began to advise and consult its leaders. This is where the new archival documents come in, to shed light on the complicated web of strategies, debates, and alliances carried out between the Comintern and the nascent CCP, all with the initial goal of expanding Russia's proletarian revolution into China. These archival documents are particularly important because, according to Professor Sage, the historical record on the CCP's development has thus far tended to be skewed, depending on who's narrating.
Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, basically historians were official historiographers for the party. So they're both going to reflect what the party wants to tell you about that period of time. And so I think if you look at the sort of first iterations of historians writing about China, it was a lot more emphasis on Soviet domination. I think what we can do now is redress that balance.
In fact, much of Professor Sach's book features the often unique viewpoints and actions of one Comintern member, Henk Sneevliet, a Dutch labor organizer and revolutionary handpicked by Lenin to lead Soviet work in China.
In a way, he becomes like the spider at the center of a web. And part of that web is not of his making, because he has to conform with what the Comintern is laying down as policy. He's got to adjust that to the reality on the ground in China. And of course, often they jar. What is happening on the ground doesn't fit ideology or policies or dictates from Moscow.
Sneevliet was tasked with navigating between various interests in Russia and China, balancing what an array of groups thought were the most effective means of establishing a revolutionary communist party in China. And, while he wasn't able to bend China entirely to his will, he was able to leave two legacies of Soviet strategy that Professor Sach says have shaped Chinese governance to this day. The first was to organize the party around the strict guidelines and structure prescribed by Lenin.
In word, if not in deed, from the beginning, the Chinese Communist Party adopted all the trappings of Leninism: hierarchical organization, democratic centralism, minority subordinate to the majority, and continually it keeps us reasserting in his party constitutions that it is a Leninist party. And that maintains down to today. I mean, if you see Xi Jinping, his belief is in the paramount power and importance of the Chinese Communist Party, and it's only the Chinese Communist Party that can really drive China forward.
The second legacy Sneevliet left with the CCP was the organizational tactic of the United Front, whereby the Communist Party combines forces with other segments of society to consolidate political power and achieve a broad mission.
The second the United Front has come and gone, depending on how accommodating the Communist Party has felt or how much it has needed others to help it meet its objectives. At times when the Chinese Communist Party wants to emphasize the economy and development, it builds united fronts and it builds connections with intellectuals, with economists, with technicians that can help it develop its policies.
The success Sneevliet found with the CCP ended under circumstances outside of his control. Over time, Soviet leadership began to prioritize their own national interests over the cultivation of a global working-class movement based in international solidarity. Sneevliet wrote to his Comintern superiors criticizing this shift. The Comintern decided to dismiss him and appointed a Bolshevik named Mikhail Borodin to take his place. Sneevliet only found out about the change when he ran into Borodin on a train as he was leaving China.
And I think there's no better symbolic moment than that, handing the baton from the global revolutionary to the good Soviet soldier and apparatchik.
Professor Sach's hope is that his book and the archival material it discusses will prompt a renewed understanding of what's possible for China through a reclamation of the CCP's history.
I think one way that they can be used, as I said, is by Chinese nationals who want to rediscover that there is a history that relates to their own movement, which is quite distinct from the official narratives. So I think it's important to know there is another history to the Chinese Communist Party, which is very open, very diverse, very engaging with different ideas. And that has gone, but it's there beneath the surface. And maybe one day, that will be retrieved for future reviews.
The book is Finding Allies and Making Revolution: The Early Years of the Chinese Communist Party, written by Tony Sach, director of the Ash Center for Democracy and Government Innovation and Daewoo Professor of International Affairs. It's published by Brill. This has been Behind the Book, a production of Library and Knowledge Services at Harvard Kennedy School. Special thanks to the Hauser Studio. Find past and future episodes of Behind the Book by subscribing to Harvard Kennedy School on YouTube, following us on Twitter at HKS Library, and visiting our website.